Hello and welcome back to Exothermic Plays Games. I'm Exothermic and the date today is Sunday, September 1st, 2024. I've been doing a countdown of my favorite video games of all time through each day of the year, and coming in at number 122 is Pokemon X and Y. Hey there! Before I spend a bunch of time talking about Pokemon, my Patreon launched today, and you can find all sorts of info about that in the description. You'll also find a link to the companion video for this game where, as I've done for each mainline Pokemon game I've ranked so far, I made an entire companion video ranking all of the new Pokemon from these games. So if that's all you want, that's where to find it. On to the game part of the game. Generation 6 contains some of the highest highs and some rough lows for the Pokemon franchise. That being said, even a quote-unquote bad Pokemon game is actually a pretty solid game. This time around, we are on the Kalos region, a place of excitement and wonder and rocks. Very cool, special rocks. I'm not going to take a ton of time explaining the core mechanics of Pokemon because at this point, I generally assume people watching these videos know what's up with the franchise. But just in case, here's a very brief overview. You train monsters called Pokemon, fighting them against each other in turn-based battles. Your Pokemon have different types to themselves, such as grass, water, or fire, and their attacks also have types. Type matchups dictate a lot of the damage attacks do, and there's also support abilities, with strategic battles utilizing several Pokemon on each team. You play through a story where you start off with basically nothing and end up typically saving the world and becoming the greatest trainer alive. The end. You've done this 9 times now, and now have only referenced yourself once, and guess what? It's not this time. So what makes X and Y stand out? Well, there's really 2 things it did that had major impacts on the franchise going forward. It introduced Mega Evolutions, and the first new Pokemon type in 14 years, with Fairy Pokemon. Fairy Pokemon are, I think, pretty awesome, and fixed a lot of the problems the franchise had come across with the type matchup system over time. Fairy is super effective against Fighting, Dark, and very importantly, Dragon. Previously, the only attacks Dragon Pokemon were weak to were Ice, the most underutilized type in the entire franchise, and other Dragon Pokemon themselves, which were admittedly also fairly rare. Now, Fairy Pokemon give them an actual counter. Defensively, Fairy Pokemon are resistant to Fighting, Bug, and Dark, and actually are immune to Dragon attacks, making that even more important. You might think that's a little too heavy-handed on the Dragon hate, but most Dragon Pokemon do have plenty of attacks that aren't actually Dragon-type anyways, so they'll still be able to fight against the Fairy Pokemon if they need to. The downsides to Fairy are that Fairy attacks are not very effective against Fire, Poison, and Steel, and Fairy takes extra damage from the latter two, solving even more matchup issues. Steel previously was only super effective against Rock and Ice. Rock is good, but again, Ice is the most underrepresented typing in the game, making Steel not actually great at attacking most of the time. Now they have another important type matchup where they get to shine. Similarly, Poison only had Grass that it was super effective against, and actually 4 different resistant types and an immune type. So mechanically, Fairy Pokemon are extremely important and greatly help the balancing of the game. Thematically, I also quite like Fairy Pokemon, giving more room for whimsical, cute designs and cementing some more identities to some of the previously just normal types, like Clefairy, which is obviously in the name. So yeah, Fairy Pokemon are great, and while they obviously exist in the other games after this too, introducing them gives Generation 6 a solid boost to me. The other main thing they added in this game was Mega Evolutions, which really kicked off the whole let's do a new gimmick every generation thing. Megas aren't my favorite gimmick, but they are a good one, and obviously I'm not the only one to think so, with them showing up outside of just this generation too. Not every Pokemon has a Mega Evolution, but for the ones that do, you can find special items for them to hold, and you can then use them once per battle to Mega Evolve, giving stat boosts and sometimes even type changing when you do so. I like this more than Dynamaxing and way more than Z-moves, and the idea that they have to hold the item does at least give some kind of opportunity cost to it, strategically speaking. I do like Mega Evolutions casually, but not so much competitively. The type changing can be fun sometimes, but otherwise it's just, hey, stat boost for the sake of it. That being said, I've only ever bothered to do remotely competitive stuff in Pokemon in exactly one Pokemon game, and this isn't it. But it was also that game's gimmick that convinced me to take the leap. So, maybe Megas, if they were better, would have done the same. Primarily, I play the Pokemon games because the monsters are fun and cute, and I like the world and the stories. That being said, the story here is not that awesome, even though the gameplay is still a lot of fun. There are elements to it I really like, though. One of the best things X and Y do for the story is your friend group. Most Pokemon titles really only have one rival, friend, whatever, that follows you along throughout the story. This game, you get an entire group of friends who are all given Pokedexes from Professor Sycamore and start your adventures together. While he encourages you to find whatever makes you happy in your journey, whether it be battles or Pokedex completion, or in the case of the best character in this game, Tierno, dancing? He also has an actual mission for you in that he wants you to go out and research Mega Evolution. Much of the plot revolves around this, and it's a cool way to really embed the new mechanic into the world in a way that's exciting. You're not just stumbling upon it and being like, oh, everyone knows this, this region does it, and no one else does, and for some dumb reason. You're instead discovering it and exploring and learning not only as the player, but also as the character. Having friends running around the world and interacting with them is pretty fun, and I think it's more interesting than having a singular rival that you just fight and then ditch every once in a while. There's more to the story than just Mega Evolutions, however. There's, of course, an obligatory evil team, this time in the form of Team Flare. They're a bit of a weird one, with a focus on fashion and appearance? But also they definitely do evil terrorist stuff, like sabotage the power in entire cities, and, want to extinguish all life on the planet. Oops. Things escalate really quickly for what feels like no real reason, but there's cool stuff about Team Flare. One of my favorite things is how they've been able to pull this all off. They actually have some members hidden throughout the world in some pretty influential positions, leading to some cool surprises, like one of the members of the Elite Four being part of the team. Some other outrageous parts of the plot is that you're being followed around by an immortal former king of the continent and his immortal Pokemon. I've beaten this game a couple of times, and I still struggle to make sense of what's going on here. Another less than stellar part of the game is that there's actually not that many new Pokemon. One of the most fun parts for each Pokemon game is checking out all of the cool new monsters. If you don't count Mega Evolutions, this game only had 69 new Pokemon, with another 30 Mega Evolutions. It leans really heavily on fan favorites, which is in some ways nice, but I also want to have, new favorites with each generation. There are some absolute bangers here though, but you can watch my companion video if you really want to hear all of that. There's a few more things I want to praise about X and Y too. Funnily enough, this was the first 3DS Pokemon game, and I think it utilized the system better than Sun and Moon did. Each of the gyms had, as is expected, a puzzle component to get to the leader, and several of these are in a 3-dimensional space, which if you do want to play with the 3D toggled on, looks great. The major city in the center of the continent that gets increasingly important as you progress through the story also totally changes your camera view to take advantage of this. You can't see it in any of my recordings because that's not how this system works as far as how I can capture it, but take my word for it that it does look great. There's some solid depth to the appearance, and while it kills the battery pretty quick, it's fun. The game utilizes the bottom screen well too, with a few cool mini-games. There's Pokemon Ami, which is a sort of Tamagotchi-like game where you can pet, feed, and play with your Pokemon, playing a few mini-games with them down there. Mostly, this is just for fun, but it does serve a practical purpose too. This is the easiest way to get your Pokemon to love you more, which is actually the condition for evolving an Eevee into Sylveon, the new fairy evolution for the Pokemon. The other really interesting gameplay element down there is super training. You can do mini games to shoot pretty much soccer balls into nets against big inflatable enemies. It's a little weird, but I'll take it. The purpose of this is to raise your Pokemon stats in a way that's way less grindy than just fighting the same Pokemon over and over and over. What it's actually doing is raising your EVs, which are basically extra stat points you can allocate to your Pokemon. Traditionally, you gain them from each Pokemon you knock out, and each species offers different stats from it. You'll actually gain the stats from those when your Pokemon levels up. Being able to do this quickly and easily was awesome for competitive players, which again, I was not. In addition to the minigame part, your Pokemon will occasionally find punching bags you can hang and have them, of course, punch, to gain quick little hits of stats. There's still some grinding involved to be sure, but it's a breath of fresh air compared to most titles and gives you very precise control. All in all, Pokemon X and Y revolutionized the franchise mechanically. They look and feel great, and the story fell victim to constantly trying to one-up itself. It was set up almost like a slice-of-life journey of friendship and discovery, which actually would have just been great if we just stuck with that, but then it way too quickly ramps up to humanity-wiping stakes. If nothing else, it stands out from the crowd and taught me to love ghost Pokemon. Oh, and if someone can tell me why someone randomly spoke German to me here, when literally every other character speaks English, I'd love to know. Join me tomorrow as I talk about my 121st favorite game, where I live many lives.